Thank you everybody for joining us today on this Friday, and welcome to the joint seminar in South Asian politics, jointly hosted by Brown, Harvard, and MIT. Today we're delighted to have Neelanjan Sircar with us. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, and was previously an assistant professor at Ashoka University in Sonipat in Haryana. He has published widely on the changing social and political transformation of India in popular and academic venues. I'm sure that many of you have read his dispatches from the field around election time. He just returned from UP, so I'm sure he has plenty of stories to tell about what's going down and who's going to win. But his publications are too numerous to name right now. But today he's going to be presenting a recent book called Colossus, The Anatomy of Delhi, that he edited, and with chapters from many folks who have published widely on Indian politics and urbanization. And then we will have, we're fortunate to have Jason Jackson with us today as a discussant. Jason is an assistant professor at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. His research focuses on the relationships between states and markets, and seeks to understand the historical origins and evolutions of the institutional arrangements through which states and markets are constituted. And a lot of this work has involved studying the evolution, the joint evolution of states and markets in India. So I'm going to step out the way for now, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Neelan to discuss the book. So Neelan, over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, wonderful. So before I get started, let me first thank the Brown South Asia Seminar, particularly Emmerich and Ashu. Emmerich I've known for a very long time. I was a postdoc at Penn while he was a grad student. I know many of you in the audience. I actually moved to India to help complete this project. So the project I'm going to be presenting today is a project that I sort of grew with academically. I had never lived in Delhi until I was tasked with helping edit and run a project on Delhi. And in those early years, many of you did provide assistance to me. Patrick and Ashu provided a lot of help to me actually early on. Patrick also has a chapter in this volume. So I'm very, very grateful for all the help that all of you have given me, but also I'm very honored to be able to speak to all of you today. Now, I know my connection is a bit faulty today, so I'm going to actually cut my video as I share my slides. I hope none of you mind. If things break, please just jump in. I'm happy to repeat or something like that. So just cut my video. Are you all able to see my screen? Okay, wonderful. So the book is entitled Colossus, Anatomy of Delhi. It is co-edited with Chandra Chakravarti, who is a professor of urban studies and geography at Temple University. He is somebody who has worked quite a bit on urbanization in India. I am somebody who had never worked on urbanization in India until this project came my way. I got a special request from some students to focus a bit more of this presentation on some of the methodology that we used in the book. And it dovetails well with the larger sort of intellectual project to understand what we did methodologically. So I thought it would be a good idea. So I'll be spending about 40% of this talk on methodology, and then 60% sort of some of the intellectual findings or leaps maybe that we've made in this project. Okay. So I wanted to understand what we've done here in this book as a part of a larger set of projects that have come out of CASI at University of Pennsylvania. And actually a larger set of projects, I've written this as CASI because that's where I was based, but a larger set of projects that are coming out of the United States more generally. Obviously, Brown is also creating a lot of work on urban space in India, and CPR has as well. But the reason why I wanted to just give this track is that it also covers a little bit about mistakes that we made in every step. So it's in some ways a very personal admission of things that we got wrong. So the book I'm going to be presenting today, the book that I'm going to be presenting today is focused on structural and spatial inequalities in the national capital region and elements of social change taking place in the region. Now, one of the real drawbacks, and you're going to see I'm going to delve into it, is that we had to learn how to define a region that is the national capital region that exists administratively on paper, but that people don't really imagine as a metropolitan region. And I'll talk about why it's important to do that in a second. Now, we started using only administrative definitions. So in this book, we're only looking at places in the national capital region that are administratively defined as urban. We learned pretty quickly, but we were already committed throughout this project, that that's an underwhelming, there's an underwhelming logic because there are political reasons why things are zoned as rural and urban. So in the later projects, we moved down a scale. So from Delhi to slightly smaller cities in the Hindi belt, Dhanbad, Patna, Indore, Varanasi. We looked more inter-household inequalities, gender, which we take a little bit of a look at in this book, but not as much as we should. But we also changed our sampling to think about places that are within 2 hours drive of the center of the city, capturing places that are administratively defined as rural, but functionally operate in very urban ways. A third project coming out of CASI, which is in some ways motivated from this work, but also motivated by work that current director Tariq Patil and Adam Auerbach are doing, is to move down even one scale smaller and to move to smaller towns and look at questions of access and governance. Okay, so the real challenge that we faced in this project was, how do you understand what the national capital region is, right? The NCR, so we froze it actually as we started the project. At that time, had 22 districts outside of Delhi across 4 states and union territories: Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh. Its urban population in the 2011 census was 30 million people, and total population was actually 50 million people, right? Because the region is notified by districts. There's a huge land area, and the population growth over these districts was approximately 20% per decade. So it's a bit of a monster, right? Now, part of the real challenge that we had in this project is that there are many towns, for those of you who know the region, that one doesn't really associate with Delhi, like Meerut. Meerut is in NCR. Panipat is in NCR. Rohtak is in NCR, right? These are cities that have cultures of their own, histories of their own, and yet are a part of the same metropolitan region administratively. Now you might think, okay, well then what's the point of studying this? But it's a strange thing that even if my life is disconnected from Delhi, the administrative definition matters a lot for many things, most prominently land prices and land politics, right? So I've been traveling to Bhanu and Uttar Pradesh, and villagers can tell you very explicitly where LDA, where Lucknow Development Authority ends, right? Because it matters for what they can sell and how much they can sell it for, right? The second part of this that's really complicated when you're thinking about social change is that these borders are extremely dynamic. right? So somebody who's born in Meerut was not born in NCR, but today lives in NCR, but hasn't ever moved from the spot in which they were born, right? So these are the kind of challenges that you're facing when you're trying to define a metropolitan region from scratch. Now, it took us a year just to put the admin data together. We were looking at polling booth level data, what is defined as urban and rural, and going basically voter list by voter list to try to figure that out. So pretty early on, we knew that we were going to call this project Colossus. It's a monster, it's chaotic, there's a lot going on. It sort of fit the project, and it's what makes it to. It was our working title, and it became the title of the book. So, on the technical side, so we understood very early on that when we were considering different kinds of sampling strategies, that our personal optimal strategy would be to use polling booths and polling booth areas. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that polling booths have lists, voter lists. So I can take a list and I can randomly sample off of that list to get people, right? Another technique that's often done is you take a settlement and you do a lightning strike, you map it really fast, right? And then you sample off of that. Now, the challenge of lightning strike over something this fast is that you're missing a lot of people who are hard to catch, right? People who might be, for instance, ironing clothes that are connected to the back of a house are very hard to catch, right? But the voter list will have them. And as I'm going to show, the voter list actually has biases, but it has more coverage than you might think. It has a certain kind of bias, right? But nonetheless, we were attuned to the fact that many people may not make voter lists. There are going to be biases. There are going to be people who you never reach, the top 0.1%, or the most mobile populations, right, who are hard to get up. So what we did was we took 80% of our sample off of the voter list. We took a random starting point to be one of the households off of the list, and then did a random walk for 20% of the sample. And then we had to do some stats, but there's a way of actually gluing these samples together to make sure that there isn't much of a bias. So in practice, we didn't see much of a bias off the voter list, or I should say that other kinds of biases probably dominate the kind of bias that comes from just using the voter list as opposed to random walk. But we were able to work out the math, and I can go through that. I'm not going to go through that in this presentation, but I can go through how to actually glue together a biased list with a random walk for those who are interested. Now, thinking a little bit more about what was in this book. So this is a stats thing for those of you who do work with large surveys. Weights are always a problem, right? And in applied statistics, we think about two kinds of weights. We think about sampling weights, right? So that is the probability with which you sample an observation. And post-stratification weights, right? Which is ex post, you look at the yield and you look and you may have certain demographic biases, and you try to correct it by weighting up certain parts of the sample and weighting down other parts of the sample to anchor it to something like the census. Now, sampling weights are typically okay. So sampling weight would say something like, I want to make sure that I get schedule casts in my sample. So I am going to sample them with twice the probability that I should. So therefore I should upweight everybody else and downweight by 1/2 schedule cast to get a representative sample, right? That's easy stats. Post-stratification is a lot more problematic. Post-stratification means that you are anchoring to something, but you may not have all of the variables that might matter. Let me give you one example. In India today, we're talking about farmers' protests. We're talking about a couple of caste groups, like the Jat community. Now, the Jat community, there is no official data for. So let us imagine that I have undersampled farmers and I weight them up. But in those farmers, I've also undersampled the Jat community. unwittingly, I've taken a biased sample that is underrepresenting chart communities and weighted it up. So I'm actually propagating my biases. I'm not removing them. Right? Now, as we deal with complicated social phenomena, because we don't know the social variables that actually matter, post-stratification starts wreaking havoc on our ability to make representative claims on social issues that matter or on sensitive issues. Right? So early on, we sort of knew that sampling weights were okay, but we would try to avoid post-stratification weights as much as possible. The goal here was to get what I call spatial representativeness, which is that you want the sample to essentially track what the distribution of the population density looks like across space. And I'll give you an explanation for why that's important. The survey covered lots of information, detailed rosters on education, employment, migrant, consumption, infrastructure, intermediaries, social network outcomes. I'm going to discuss some of these things. I won't discuss many of these things. I'll show you the table of contents at the end. Okay, so once we've sampled a set of polling booths, which we believe are representative across space, right? And as I said, the reason why polling booths are important for us is that broadly polling booths are placed where people are. So the distribution of polling booth areas mirrors the population density across space. Within a polling booth, let's imagine that we have a polling booth that has a voter list of 1,000 voters. What we did was that we developed a very explicit replacement protocol. So let's imagine that I need to select 5 voters out of 1,000. What I did was I broke the 1,000 person voter list into 10 equally sized blocks. I randomly picked every other block and randomly sampled a person in that. So my 5 sampled people, one would be between 0 and 100 on the voter list, 200 and 300, 400 and 500, 600 and 700, and so on. Right? Now, the reason I've done that is because this gives me spatial spread across the polling booth area. Voter list, so a person who is number 50 will be living next to somebody who's person 51 on the voter list, right? So they're spatially oriented. Now, if I couldn't get the person I sampled, I replaced up to 5 replacements within this block. So if I couldn't find the person from 0 to 100, I picked a replacement within 0 to 100. Now, randomly, I picked either the gray blocks that you see, 0 to 100, 200 to 300, or the flip, right? The reason why we kept a gap between the voters that we're sampling is that we wanted to make sure that we weren't sampling 2 voters from the same household, right? Now, this might seem like, okay, this is onerous. It actually takes quite a bit of code. Why would you do this? What I want to argue for you, and this is important for those of you who sort of came through poli-sci programs my time. They used to tell you never to replace because replacement causes bias. Now, the problem is, the reason why they were saying that is that many of the people who were worried about replacement were doing experiments. And people who are doing experiments care about randomization on top of the sample, but there's very little interrogation about the representativeness in the underlying sample. Now, what ends up happening, as I'm going to show you, is if you don't replace on sensitive issues in particular, you start getting very non-representative responses. Okay, so here's a sort of a simple puzzle for us to work through. Consider 2 blocks, A and B, equal size. For a particular yes/no question, people in block A always answer no, people in block B always answer yes. But people in block A only respond 50% of the time, while they always answer in block B. We plan to sample 10 people from each of block A and block B. Blocks are of equal sizes. The true percentage in the population answering yes is 50%. If I don't replace at all, I'll get 10 out of 10 people answering in block B, and I'll expect that 5 out of 10 people will answer in block A. And so I'll get 10 out of 15 yeses, right? and 5 no's. So that would say that the percentage is 67%. Now let me allow one replacement. Now the percentage of people in my sample answering yes in expectation goes to 57%. Why? 50% of the people are answering, 50% of the time people are not answering you and blocking. But the probability that 2 people back to back don't answer you is 25%, right? So that probability, so sooner or later, you're going to hit somebody who's willing to respond to you. So 2 replacements, I get to 53%. 5 replacements, I start getting right around 50%, right? So replacing within blocks in populations that are similar to the people that you are replacing is actually a very good strategy for minimizing bias on sensitive questions, right? This is very, very important, but it also makes use of a spatial property that many of us know in India, which is, for instance, if you're going to villages, but even cities, caste groups, religious groups tend to live side by side, right? So often, just by spatially replacing, you are actually engendering a certain level of demographic representativeness. Okay, so this is what the spatial distribution, the sample, looked like. I gave a talk a couple of days ago, and as somebody said, this looks like an archipelago, right? Because you have these little clusters. Meerut is a big city, you have a lot of sample there. Obviously, Delhi is the biggest city, big suburbs, Faridabad, Gurugram, Noida, Ghaziabad have some sample, and some of these smaller towns get some sample as well. But this area in between is missing because it's not characterized as urban. That's something that I see as a weakness of this project, and something that I feel has been corrected in future work. Okay. We checked what the demographic representativeness looks like. Now, for the most part, we seem to have done okay. We've under-yielded on the Muslim population. Almost every social survey compared to the census does, actually. These are just comparing in Delhi. But otherwise, we have other measures as well. We've actually representatively done quite well. And so this is sort of a proof of concept of the kind of sampling that we did. Okay, but this, by the way, is just demographic representativeness, not what I call spatial representativeness. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Okay, so some of you might be interested in what is this point of going off of the voter list versus the random walk. So there's something interesting that happens, right? Which is that when if I'm hitting somebody on the voter list, there's always, of course, somebody in the household who's on the voter list. Eligible voters are people who are 18 plus in India. And what you can see is the proportion of households that basically have all eligible voters voting is the same across random walk and the voter list. But there are many households that will have somebody who's married in recently, a child who's not on the voter list. They're eligible to be on the voter list, but they're not on the local voter list. That number is slightly higher and statistically significantly higher for random walks. So what this means, and what we saw, and then again, a number of tests one can run, is that are the voter lists biased? Voter lists biased? Yes. But typically households will have somebody on the voter list, and that has something to do with being a beneficiary, right? Of course, there's still biases. I think the real poorest of the poor will not be on the voter list. We should be open about that. They're not going to be in our sample. And I suspect even a random walk from voting people won't capture the most mobile communities who live far away from these places, right? But for the most part, this is the kind of bias you get off of sampling off the voter list, and which is why the random walk doesn't actually make a huge difference in most of our aggregates. Okay, so now I'm going to get to some of the substantive work. Just very quickly, how much time do I have? I see it's 10:58. Until what time? Sorry, I'm speaking Indian time. Until what time should I go?
So you have between 45 and 50 minutes. So.
Okay, great. So I've used up about 28 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So first thing you can do is that you can take the distribution of points. You can look at the identity of individuals or households, and you can see the distribution. So you can see that this is kind of the overall distribution within the national capital region of everybody. The scheduled caste population is a little more concentrated in the southeast border of Delhi and northeast Delhi. The Muslim population is even more concentrated in the northeast part of Delhi and the southeast part of Delhi. This, by the way, this northeast part of Delhi is the part of Delhi that recently saw very, very ugly riots. I have a lot of discussion, and we have a lot of discussion in the book about why we're seeing these kinds of clustering patterns very quickly. There is caste-wise discrimination, which characterizes space, which we all know from the study of India. In urban space, the context of Hindu-Muslim segregation is also one born out of safety and intimidation, which is why you're seeing this scale of clustering. I'll give you a data point earlier, which suggests just how much more clustering there is in the Muslim community versus even scheduled castes in national capital region. Delhi, as we've seen recently, is a riot-prone city. It had not had major riots for a long time, but in the past it has had riots, and perhaps we're returning back to that in Delhi. Okay. So one of the things that we did was we created an asset index based on what people own, and we ran some simulations to understand across various identity groups where the median person stands. So the median Sikh person in the national capital region is at the 80th percentile, so they're very wealthy. The Hindus, which are the vast majority, are right around the median, the 51st percentile. And Muslims are on average poor, systematically poor. The median Muslim is at the 39th percentile of wealth. Okay. You can see that we can break it down across these general, very administratively defined categories for caste, and that the scheduled caste communities and the Muslim communities have very, very similar levels of wealth in our sample. The other thing that you can do is that you can take the point data and you can build spatial surfaces on top of the point data. Now, this is not a very easy thing to do, and I'm going to describe how we did it in a second. So I showed you up here what the underlying sample had. Now, each of these points has an underlying wealth level. Using these points and these wealth levels, we then constructed these surfaces, right? Where darker means that people are poorer and lighter means that people are wealthier. And one of the big takeaways here is that you can see that very poor live next to very rich, right? So this is just central Delhi, and you can sort of see very poor areas next to very rich areas, back next to very poor areas, back to very rich areas. In fact, the scale of inequality of people living side by side is greater than the scale of inequality between median persons across identity, right? And we argue here, or it's actually a chapter I wrote, that what we're seeing in the national capital region is that the wealthy have a certain kind of labor dependence. So the spatial orientation of rich next to poor is actually driven by the fact that spatial proximity yields bonds of trust between those who employ and those who are employed, right? So domestic work often lives in a poor neighborhood next to a wealthy neighborhood, right? Okay, so a brief discussion about how we constructed these surfaces, and then I will go straight to substantive, and then I'll be done with all the crazy stat stuff. Now, this is a problem, right? Because typically when you want to create surfaces, so what I would tell you just very quickly for those people who want to create surfaces. Do not do it from survey data unless you're sure that it's spatially representative, right? Very bad things will happen, right? So typically we use census type data, right? So we don't have to deal with these issues. Let me give you a sense of what's happened, what we're doing here. So what we've done here is what's called the spatial spline. So to understand what a spatial spline does, let me first tell you what a spline does, okay? What a spline does is first, I've just given you a series of points and I want to flexibly fit a function into these points. You can see that the data are broadly clustered into 4 areas here. Some of these are have a lot of points, some of these have very few points. Okay? And this is the true function from which I drew the points, right? It's actually a sine curve. Now what a spline does is it takes these knots, right? It takes these points in space, right? And it fits a function only between 2 of these cuts, and then between 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 these cuts. So you get something like this if you're fitting lines. Okay? This is the true function. So you can kind of see it's not too far off. Now, typically the kind of spline that we use, what it does is it uses not just lines, but something up to the 3rd degree. And it makes sure that these points are joined. So you're going to get one smooth surface. Okay. But you have to be very, very careful about where these knots are. Okay. Here's an example of very, very bad knot placement, right? So here I've taken 6 knots, just as I did before, but the entire middle is missing. And you can see that the spline, the blue curve, did some weird thing here. It just sort of averaged in between. It completely missed these points, right? This is now a spline run with having put knots basically at the center of each of the cluster. And you can see it fits much better. Okay, so all of this is to convince you that where you put points in space are very, very important for any kind of curve fitting, right? And you can imagine that I need to make sure that these clusters are in the right places. So if I'm not spatially representative, I'll have clusters in places they should be. And the density of the clusters, the number of people in the clusters, is proportional to what they are. Otherwise, things are going to go off. Right? So we did a very, very similar procedure. We knew where the clusters were in the data. And then we put knots, we put these points that would structure the data right at the center of the clusters that we've surveyed. And so that's exactly what this is. And you can see that you end up getting many, many more knots. You get a lot more precisely where there's much, much more sand, right? That's a natural feature. And so that's how you engender stability in this. Now, if I had tried to do the same procedure on non-spatially representative data, I would get curves in spaces that look very, very different. So one way to think about what spatial representativeness means is that it is representative as much as possible down to every point on the map. Okay. Another way in which one can think about space, this is a chapter by Shominder Nath Roy. This is actually using data that was also part of a project that Patrick was on, the Cities of Delhi project jointly with CPR. So I'm just presenting a bit of Shominder's chapter here, but there's a lot more actually. So one of the things that we see in Delhi is that over time, you can see that the built area is sort of spreading out from the center, right? These lighter colored areas are newer settlements, right? And UC means unauthorized colony, and RUC is regularized unauthorized colony. You can see that they kind of basically show up all across them, right? Mixed colonies, places that are planned and maybe have some unplanned areas, are a much smaller clustered set. One of the interesting things that Shominder shows is that where you live is actually as much a determinant of basic amenities as very, very important asset-based or identity-based measures. So to give some example of this, somebody who is in the lowest quartile of the asset distribution right? So very poor, but living in a mixed colony has a 38.4% chance or 0.4 probability of having a house with basic amenities, right? A similar probability for scheduled castes and Muslims. That number is much, much higher than people from the top quartile of the assets living in basically slum areas, regional pre-clusters or SDA slum development areas, or upper caste living in those areas, right? You can sort of play around with this. You can see rural and urban villages, people are living much better as compared to unauthorized colonies, so on and so forth, right? So there is a large spatial component to the quality of life that somebody has, which is a function of just where they live, settlement where they live. In fact, there's another chapter by Khurshid Kaur Malhotra, which shows that even controlling for asset wealth and identity, people who are migrating into the city systematically live in areas with poor infrastructure. So basically, there's a first mover advantage to people who were born in Delhi. This is just sort of showing, just so people don't jump ahead of me, that internally, upper castes are still doing better than scheduled castes and Muslims. So it isn't as if there isn't identity-based variation, but in the across variation in some sense is greater than the within variation. Now, the next set of questions that I wanted to sort of very quickly go through was a question a lot of political scientists care about, right? Which is one way of thinking about how to access the state is, the use of dalals, brokers, intermediaries. So we ran a, we're running a large survey here, right? So we actually asked three basic sets of questions. First, we asked people, do you have an intermediary that you go to for local problems? Second, if you've named somebody, so these are all conditional probabilities, have you ever approached that person and with what issue? And third, if you approach the person with an issue, was the intermediary able to solve the issue, right? So this is a chain of conditional probabilities. Yeah. Just to show you that, intuitively things make sense. In Delhi proper, where the state is more present, about 70% of people have someone they can approach. By the time you get to the outskirts, right? So places outside of those main suburbs, right? Things I was showing you on the edges, around 90% of people are having to go to or have access to an intermediary, right? So this idea that intermediaries and the state are substitutes. Okay. So one of the interesting things that we find here is that, of course, there is homophily, there is caste-wise clustering. Somebody who is general caste is more likely to go to a general caste person as compared to an OBC and SC and ST. OBCs, so you can see this diagonal is very high. Actually, let me take one step back. The way that you read, this is a certain kind of a cluster plot. The way that you read this is that the rows add up to 1. So this is the proportion of people who are in the respondent's caste this is the proportion of intermediaries who also have that caste. So the way you read this is for people who are of the general caste, 27% of them approach an intermediary who is from an intermediate or OBC caste. 3% of them approach someone who is from the scheduled caste. Among scheduled castes, 17% of the time they approach another scheduled caste person. So you can see that scheduled caste people go to scheduled caste more than other castes, right? But it is still the case that a scheduled caste person is much more likely to have an upper caste intermediary or an OBC intermediary than a scheduled caste intermediary. So you see this kind of caste sorting and this kind of education and caste-based means tests all across our sample for the intermediaries. Then we sort of look at the set of grievances that are being brought forth. Poor people systematically are much more likely. So the x-axis here is going poor to rich, and the y-axis is the proportion naming the issue. So poor people are much more likely to mention a civic issue, which is like garbage collection or something like that, sanitation, right? Rich people are much more likely to mention a large infrastructure issue, road correction, street lights. Security and safety also emerges as a bigger issue for wealthier people. Now, one of the things that we argue here is that we want to understand between rich and poor, who is being served, because it tells you about the biases and the kinds of issues that the intermediaries deal with. And we do find that systematically, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to have your issue solved by the intermediary. What that means is that insofar as an issue is taken up through an intermediary, there's likely to be a bias towards correcting issues of infrastructure as compared to civic services, precisely because those are issues that the wealthier bring up vis-a-vis poor. Okay. A final set of issues that I want to talk about here, I can see I have 6 minutes, right? Sumitra Badrinathan and Devesh Kapoor wrote a chapter on commensality. Commensality is the willingness to eat with another person. We actually had a much larger set of questions on this. Unfortunately, we had to cut a lot of it because there was a very ugly lynching incident not too far outside of Delhi when somebody was accused of eating beef. So we understood that this was a very sensitive topic. What this graph is showing you is that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to both invite somebody else and eat at somebody else's home. So there are major wealth effects in simply engaging in commensality. What we find is that it's a very complicated phenomenon. As Hindus get wealthier, they are more likely to have eaten or eat with Muslims. The same is plausibly true of Muslims, but these standard errors are very high. So in fact, there's not much of a difference. The baseline rate, if you look at the poorest Muslims, the baseline rate is actually quite a bit higher for Muslims eating with Hindus than vice versa. Right? So in other words, as things seem to get a little bit better in terms of commensality across religion, as Hindus get wealthier, but on the poorer side of the spectrum, we're seeing some very frightening results. When we asked our Hindu respondents to tell us why they are not sharing a meal with the Muslim, one way to read this is, oh, well, 60% simply don't know Muslims, so maybe there aren't scary things. The other way to read this is 40% of people, even with all the response biases you can think of, are openly saying that they have purity concerns or uncomfortable eating Muslims. Right? The two different ways of reading this. But the point is that a lot of people do genuinely report not having friends or family from a different religion or a different caste. And so going back to this point about spatial clustering, so we actually ran some more data. So we looked at our spatially representative sample, right? 16% of our sample over all of NCR was scheduled caste. Now, one would expect then within 1 kilometer, if the distribution of the population is even, within 1 kilometer, there would be 16% scheduled caste. There are 30%. For Muslims, they are 11% of our sample. But within 1 kilometer, the probability of meeting another Muslim household is 40%. Right? So there's a little bit more spatial clustering. When we think about actual interaction, so we think about clustering not just in terms of space, but actually who you interact with. Conditional on meeting another person, interacting with another person, a neighbor, a person from the scheduled caste community, that conditional on having met that person, 44% of the time, that household was also scheduled caste. Among Muslims, conditional on having met a neighbor, 81% of the time, that household was Muslim. So that just tells you that beyond spatial clustering, the scale of segregation in terms of interaction that you're seeing within Delhi. Okay. Now that's the last substantive sort of set of comments I have. I want to just sort of quickly end. I have 90 seconds here. The rest of the book. This is a book that started with me as a postdoc. The brainchild was Devesh Kapoor, who at that time was the head of CASI. And Chandra Chakraborty, my co-editor, of course, came in and gave this a very large framing. In my very narrow view, I only sort of imagine this as a survey and a couple of papers. And credit to Devesh and credit to Shanjoy for seeing the scale of what was possible in this project. So just very quickly, the first part of the book talks about structural and spatial inequalities of the sort that we have talked about, right? The last two chapters, one by Radhika Koslak talks about overconsumption and consumption energy, and by Milan Vaishnav and Matthew Lillehaugen talked about crime in the national capital leadership. We've talked a little bit about Sumitra and Devesh's chapter on religion, caste, and class. Megan Reed, who's finishing a PhD in sociology at Penn, talks about marriage, cross-caste, cross-religious marriage. The story is quite dismal. The only kind of change you see is that people getting married do seem to have a bit more say in their partners today as compared to a couple of generations ago. Education, Delhi, like many other high income areas within India, women have more than caught up to men in education, but it does not translate to employment. Rather, the authors find that higher education translates to quote unquote better outcomes in the marriage market. Sanjay Srivastav does an ethnographic study of a slum which has since been demolished and a fancy high-rise. Netas and intermediaries I've talked about today briefly. Adnan Farooqi talks about one of the most fascinating things in Delhi, the rise of a new party, Aam Aadmi Party, and the social basis of it. And finally, Avadinda Sharan ends this volume. He's an environmental historian, for those of you that don't know, talking about the history of negotiation around the climate and the environment in Delhi and the region. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening to this winding, complicated talk across methodology and sets of issues. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Neelan, for that colossus of a talk, if I may. Now we have Jason Jackson, who will be providing discussant comments before we all open it up to Q&A from the audience. So Jason, over to you.
Great, thank you. Sorry for the delay. I had to get unmuted. So first, thanks very much to the organizers, to Ashu, to Emmerich, for inviting me to comment on Neelan's presentation and really on to talk a little bit about this book, which I think is super. I'm really excited to see this book out. The chapters, as Neelan just described, cover a range of just crucial issues, both in urbanization generally, in urbanization in developing country contexts more specifically, and then obviously in the Delhi region, where I've spent a bit of time, so I was particularly excited to sort of see how they approach some of these really crucial issues of sort of social change, political change in the context of Delhi. And I think these are particularly salient. I mean, they're always obviously very important, But I have to say, I feel like they're particularly salient in this moment when we're seeing a lot of really sort of worrying developments in India. So Neelan mentioned, of course, issues of lynching, Hindu-Muslim violence, and so forth. And so I think these questions, 10 years ago, I feel like we would have thought about these a lot in the terms of the classical literature, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment, of to what extent does urbanization sort of foster social change, foster economic development, improve livelihoods, and so forth. And obviously, those are still really centrally important questions. But I think in our current context in India generally, and also in places like Delhi, in really big metros, Delhi, Mumbai, etc., there are these issues of communal violence that are really crucial for us to think about. So that I think is very important. I'm going to come back to that sort of towards the end of my comments, but I just wanted to start there. Okay, so what I was asked to do is to talk about, really to focus on one of the chapters, which is the chapter by Badranathan and Kapoor, which Neelan just talked a little bit about a few moments ago. So that's going to be my main area of focus. But really, before I do that, it's impossible not to say, and I think crucial to say that, the statistical work that's gone into this project is extremely impressive in sort of two ways. I mean, so one is methodologically, and it's really helpful and nice that Neelan spent so much time sort of going through a lot of the methodological innovations that were put into place in order to make this project possible. I think the importance of this really can't be underestimated because many of us, I'm guessing on this in this seminar, sort of recognize the really big challenges in doing this kind of work sort of everywhere. I mean, so even in industrialized, even in urban areas and industrialized countries, these are really big problems, these kinds of sampling issues. How do you really get at the kinds of populations, the issues that we care about, and the ways in which they affect the populations with which are most concerned, which are the poor and underserved? It's very difficult whether you're talking about New York or you're talking about Delhi. So that's one thing I think which is really important to say. So clearly there are challenges in developing country context, but these are general challenges. And so one of the things that's really exciting, I think, about the kind of methodological innovations that Neelan just sort of talked about is the extent to which they're not only helpful for us thinking about these questions in urban India or the parts of South Asia or the parts of the developing world more generally, but they can also be brought to bear on questions in the US and in Europe, especially again thinking about the challenges of really getting at understanding underserved populations. So I think that's really important to say, so I wanted to note that. The other thing, which is really nice as well, and especially my colleagues in my department would really like, is the geospatial dimension, which not only allows us to really get at some of the key mechanisms that are at work in urbanization. So how does proximity affect social changes in social attitudes and so forth, which is Badranathan and Kapoor's kind of main focus, which I'll talk about now. But also it allows for really nice visualizations. And we saw some examples of that in the presentation just now. So again, I just want to congratulate Neelan and his co-editor and really all the contributors to the volume for this, and really to highlight how important I think it is. All right, so let me turn now to focusing on the chapter on urbanization and sort of social change in India. Sorry, in the NCR region. So the big question that Badranathan and Kapoor ask is, what are the impacts of urbanization on social identities and social cleavages in the NCR region? So as I mentioned a few moments ago, this is a really important and crucial question. It's a big ticket question that has animated a lot of work in social theory and urban theory for the past 150 years. So I mean, on one hand, the sort of framing is that urbanization, or the idea rather, is that urbanization as a process, and as a process of modern capitalism, and here we might think about urbanization in a capitalist context as distinct from urbanization in pre-capitalist contexts. Urbanization transforms core societal organizations. So the family, of course, as well as the community, and we can think about how the community is defined, whether it's spatial, whether it's in terms of kinship networks, and so forth. It changes the nature and density of social interactions, so how people engage with one another. It, of course, has labor market effects with respect to the types of work that that's available and the type of work that people do, so the diversity of occupations and so forth. And from a kind of political perspective, it is expected to have implications for individual freedoms, particularly at the personal level, so personal freedoms. Cities in this respect are sites of social change that offer, paths to mobility by disrupting, and this mechanism is crucial, by disrupting sort of forms of social stratification that characterize or are seen to characterize non-urban areas, so rural societies, more traditional societies. So there's a traditional modern transformation that's kind of at the core of this. So these theories, of course, go back a long way, as the authors note in their introduction, all the way back to social theorists like Georg Simmel, to Fernand Tannis, and of course to Marx, who, as many of us know, specifically discussed Indian villages in his broader interventions in thinking about in commenting on how urbanization sort of broke the sort of shackles of, he would see them as feudal shackles explicitly, the sort of shackles of tradition, just by virtue of people being in greater contact with one another in urban spaces and in the factory, in places of work. In India specifically, this has been a crucial animating idea and a crucial part of India's own sort of founding narratives in a number of ways, including some that have tension. So one animating tension, for example, is between Gandhi, for instance, who of course lauded villages and in particular traditional village life, albeit as a particular kind of modernity. As counterposed perhaps to Ambedkar, who famously said, what is a village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. So on one hand, we have this idea of urban spaces and urbanization as a process, as facilitating breaking of old social bonds and formations of new ones. But of course, in India, we want to think about this in the context of issues of caste, religion, gender, class, and try to understand the extent to which these are resilient against or vulnerable to the sort of processes of modernization that are seen to go with urbanization. Okay, so the authors have a couple of key mechanisms. And so this is the question the authors really are posing. Again, so this is a really big, important question. And the mechanism that the authors really highlight is exposure. So for them, they suggest that urban areas tend to have much more heterogeneous populations, which will result in people being exposed to non-traditional, having greater exposure to non-traditional attitudes. A key element of this, on one hand, is where people live, but also where they work and the particular types of work that they do. And so this ties in crucially with issues of education. That I would suggest that education here has to be taken into consideration along with various forms of discrimination that take place. So we can't just think about labor markets, labor market outcomes as determined by education levels, but of course the ways in which gender, caste, class discrimination religious discrimination play huge roles as well. The key here, though, is for them is thinking about migration. And so to what extent do some of these effects that the literature suggests that urbanization has, to what extent do we observe these when we look at the experiences of migrants? So on one hand, migrants are seen as less likely to break down traditional barriers, caste, religion, etc. And the authors find that urbanization does in fact lead to changes in social attitudes and behaviors. A key one, for example, being commensality, which Neelan talked about towards the end of his comments, so people eating, sort of sharing food and eating together. That said, the author's data also demonstrates that there's some challenges here in terms of the extent to which we observe these kinds of behaviors. The most important one, which is cited in the survey data, really revolves around the lack of interaction, the absence of family and friends, of people outside of immediate familial circles who might be different in terms of caste and religion. And so this is where I think the sort of the main issue that I sort of noted at the very outset, I think again becomes really very crucial. That is the extent, how should we think about the particular ways in which the current context in India generally, but also in metros like the Delhi region, sort of heightened tensions on one hand around, of course, the Hindu-Muslim axis, but then also more broadly as well, if we think about what's been taking place in, or what had been taking place in Punjab around the farmer protests, which of course were brought to Delhi. So if we think about the particular kind of context in the Delhi region now, these sort of like heightened communal tensions, how do these shape the kinds of outcomes that we see from the survey data? Now, I know that a challenge, this is one of the big questions I had when reading the chapter, because it's not, because I'd love to have seen it be addressed a bit more. Now, I recognize that, of course, one big challenge in this is that the book in general and the chapter in particular is building on survey data that's current. And so there's not necessarily data over time in order to look at changes, but it would have been interesting to have discussion in the chapter that would at least allow us to try to draw some inferences about the changes that we might observe over the course of the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, as we've seen this oscillation beginning in the 90s, beginning in the mid-90s, between, at the national level, certainly between BJP rule and Congress rule, and then especially allow us to think about what we're observing now under BJP rule under Modi, where again, these issues of communal violence have really been a sort of central feature of the changing social landscape in India. So that's something that perhaps might be interesting for us to talk about in the Q&A. So I'll end my comments there, and mostly just wanted to go back and say again that to really highlight and congratulate the authors and the editors for the really rigorous and methodologically innovative work that went into capturing the kinds of data that would allow us to ask and answer many of these questions on urbanization generally in the Delhi region. I really look forward to seeing additional work, and others, hopefully will pick up the mantle and take on some of these types of approaches and bring them to understanding some of these questions in other parts of India and South Asia generally. But as I said before, I really think that they can help us to really move further ahead in understanding the effects of urbanization on underserved populations in particular, who tend to be missing in much of the data, even in industrialized countries. So thanks very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jason, for those comments, and just to echo Jason, to remark on the sheer ambition of the work, and recognize hope that it also spurs additional work on urbanization in similar forms in different places in South Asia and Delhi itself. As we move into the Q&A and people gather their questions, I wanted to abuse my position as host and start off with the first question, and picking up on one of the points that Jason made about urbanization as a process of social change that offers a path to mobility. And Neelan, at the very beginning, you gave this example of Lucknow, and everybody sort of had an imaginary of what Lucknow was and what it meant to be from Lucknow versus something like the NCR, which is a little bit more ambiguous in the imaginary. But urbanization isn't also just a process of spatial agglomeration and movement to more dense areas, but it's also a change in sort of legal and political structures, right? And you are grouping places in 4 different states into one that have very, very different legal structures for how we think about how we might recognize the state and interact with the state, and how that might affect how we mobilize and recognize with our neighbors as well. And I wonder if you had anything to say about sort of this grouping of 4 or 5 different legal legal regimes across various states, and how we should think about things like social change as a result under various legal regimes. I invite everybody else to ask questions of Neelan and use the raise your hand tool, and I will call on you as we progress. Why don't we take a couple of questions, and then Neelan, you can respond to Jason's comments as well as the questions we have. So Prerna, Patrick, and Ashu, and then Neelan, we'll kick it back over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Emmerich, for having us all here together, and thank you, Neelan. I just want to kind of echo what both Jason and Emmerich have said, which is just to really compliment you and express deep admiration for the kind of both the ambition, but also the way in which you've executed this project. And I learned so much from the overview, and also Jason from your comments. And I don't actually have the ability to video myself. So it's not because I don't want to show myself. It's just, I think it's limited because of the bandwidth. So my question really kind of follows up in some ways on Jason's, and also relates to this point. And I guess not having read the book, and I apologize, is trying to kind of understand this link between something that has been brought out so clearly now, just not only through your edited volume, but also in the broader Pew survey. And here at Brown, we had hosted a discussion on the findings of the Pew survey, and this complete separation of spheres between Hindus and Muslims. So it's not just commensality, as you pointed out, it's just like entirely separate spheres of existence, which really, I think, calls into question the kind of whole idea of what did kind of, in a way, secularism or syncretism or mixing between religious communities actually mean, especially in as much as we think of urban areas as this kind of site for mixing. And I was just kind of wondering if you could, given the finding from the Devesh Kapoor Sumitra Badrinathan article, along with the Pew finding, how in a way the data that you have collected and analyzed might be able to kind of help us understand that. And what I mean by that is, I just found it so interesting when you broke it up and said it's not just kind of residential segregation, it's also this question is about what now? Like, you have done.
Lost you, Prerna.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We lost you in the last minute. So if you can repeat what you said in the last minute.
Oh, sorry. It's not profound. It's mostly just to kind of say that, there is this, sorry, I don't know what the problem is with my internet, but it's mostly just to say that, you have this amazing data, this amazing kind of data and the analysis of it. Can you help us understand a little bit about how your data and your analysis of it, particularly as regards, for instance, residential segregation, but also kind of breaking that up further, the really tantalizing comment that you had about how where you live is more determinative in a sense of your access to public services than even, your position in the kind of asset hierarchy. So I'm just wondering if, you can just kind of speculate a little bit about how the data that you have could help us understand, to me, what is one of these kind of key salient, relatively new empirical findings about Indian society, which is the Pew finding and also the Kapoor and Badrinathan finding, which is about this complete separation of spheres. And I think this has implications for the kind of larger political situation that we find ourselves in. So I guess the broad question is about the potential of your data and about your own anticipation about how this data will be used by you and by others, and to kind of link it to this particular question of the chapter that we read and discussed, which I think links to the kind of finding of the Pew. So sorry, that was a little long, but compliments and huge admiration again for the project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Perna. Patrick, and then Ashu, and then we'll turn it back to Neelan.
Yeah, Neelan, I had a sort of front seat view of the process of putting this book together. And it is quite extraordinary, to echo what everyone has said, and the way you brought it all together. And your presentation was fantastic. And I want to build on Perna's point as well, the spatial finding, which the project that I have with Ashu and Banu and others who are here, we're finding similar things that in some way identity almost matter. Obviously it matters, caste and religion. But where you're located in the city has this huge effect on the level of services you get. And I think that's an incredibly important finding. And so I have a question about it, and it goes to Jason's comments. I mean, he mentioned all the classical theorists except Weber. Weber in Economy and Society has a very long chapter on the city, and Weber's impossible to summarize, but basically, if there was one word that summarizes his view of the city, it's rationing. You have incumbents, and you mentioned that the firstborn in Delhi are much better off than recent migrants. Cities are rationed, and the Indian city in particular is highly rationed. Those who arrive late or later find it much more difficult to get access, including to basic services. An obvious mechanism is property prices, right? I mean, if you don't have a lot of income and you can't buy into a nice planned neighborhood, you're in another kind of neighborhood, right? So, and that's the obvious one. It's what economists focus on. But I want to ask you about the role of the state, because one of your findings, which echoes some other findings, including the chapter that I have in there with Partho and Subhadra and Shahana. The state plays a huge role, right? I mean, apartheid had 4 classifications. The Indian city, Delhi, has 8 classifications. Unauthorized, regularized, unauthorized, JCC, slum, designated slum, et cetera. And those designations are legal designations, and they shape how state authorities actually treat those populations. So, and you mentioned some of the findings, but there's so many in the book. So I just want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the mechanisms through which space is made to be this rationing effect and creates these spatial inequalities.
Thank you, Patrick. Ashu, you have.
Yeah. The idea that the Gandhi versus Ambedkar formulation Jason touched upon, and Prerna's point about what the Pew survey found also is very important, but I think it leads to the following questions. And do you have, does your data, Neelan, allow you to answer that? Now, in a way, because you say NCR, National Capital Region, is about 50 million people, 30 million are in the cities and 20 million are rural. I don't know whether you were able to sample rural at all, but if you did sample rural, then one could perhaps compare quite systematically, given your methodological dexterity demonstrated in the first 40 minutes, first 25 minutes of the talk, you could systematically begin to answer what Ambedkar proposed as a hypothesis. He was convinced, it was not a hypothesis, let's just call it Ambedkar hypothesis now, that the sink of ignorance that the village is, and which is basically a cesspool for Dalits. I mean, he also uses the term cesspool. That city will be the site of liberation for Dalits. Do you see in your data, if you have rural data also there, do you see either reduced intensity of caste affiliation in the urban parts of your data compared to the rural? or the Ambedkar question, namely the Dalits are treated better in the city compared to the village? Can you answer that? However you wish to. I mean, I think commensality is one, but treating someone as a human being is another, as opposed to a lesser, as opposed to someone who has no rights or no dignity at all. Endogamy, I think, is very hard to tackle. Endogamy continues. That's another way to answer that. I don't know whether on endogamy you had any data, but generally speaking, how would you be able to answer Ambedkar's question on Hindu-Muslim relations? Remember, Jason expressed a lot of concern about that. But the violence data is very clear. Hindu-Muslim violence does not take place on the whole in the village. It takes place in the city. We provided huge evidence for that in our project, where Stephen Wilkinson and I have a huge data set on this. It makes it very clear that even if you say that rural violence is rural riots underreported, even when you say that and make assumptions for how much it might be underreported by, urban India is the overwhelming site of Hindu-Muslim riots and violence, not the village. So I don't know whether you can see the Hindu-Muslim comparison in the rural part of the data and the urban part of data and how it comes out in NCR. So both of my questions, in other words, deal with the urban-rural comparison, whether your data allows you to answer Ambedkar and allows you to deal with the argument we made that urban India is the problem for rioting, not rural India, which is incidentally also the argument of Ashish Nandi, but we differ from him in some ways. But Ashish Nandi made this argument long ago. This is a problem of urban India. I'm done.
All right, Neelan. A number of questions for you to mull over and try to respond to. So the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you for those wonderful comments, and of course these questions, comments from Jason, and this, questions from old friends. I think one of the things, sort of a large comment before I get into the actual responses, we're fairly open about, I think even in the book, what we're not able to do or where there needs to be more work. Now, just a little bit of a timeline. It's very unfortunate. So these data are collected in 2017. They actually were to go to press in 2019. And then there was a slowdown, and then there was a riot, and then there was COVID, and then there was, so actually, all of this work was done and submitted and largely copy edited before the Delhi riots ever took place, before the second wave of COVID ever hit Delhi, right? So there are a couple of ex post writings. So we have little bridges between the parts where we've actually reflected back. And there we mention that while we've not obviously talked about the riots, you can tell in our discussion of Hindus and Muslims in the volume that trouble is brewing, right? Even if we didn't know what that trouble would entail. And I gave you some of that data about the interaction and the lack of networks, these two separate spheres, as Prerna put it. Separation of spheres, I think, is a wonderful way of putting what we were starting to see emerge in the data even in 2017. So starting with Jason's comments, what does, the sort of heightened tension that we're seeing in recent years on Hindu-Muslim issues, how does that bring to bear on the kinds of outcomes that we've commented on in this volume and, exacerbate or not other comments, right? So I think if So, it's one of those things we now understand. It's funny, as I said, I mentioned all of the questions we had to throw out about, so we threw out a question on whether you eat meat, right, for instance, because it was too sensitive, right? We couldn't, In retrospect, one wonders, should we have pushed some of the envelope if we thought that we could have kept everyone safe and asked some of these more difficult questions. So you will see that all of the authors are doing a little bit of mental gymnastics, because I think in some ways the most difficult questions are not asked. And that was a call we made because of safety reasons. But of course, we didn't know what was going to befall Delhi. So I would say that, of course, there are questions about commensality, which I think are very central to the way that one thinks about Delhi. And, the one sort of spin that I would add here is that you, in some sense, the issue around commensality, if it was about dietary rules and purity, that's not good either. But that, in some sense, would be a little more comforting because it falls within the realm of social norms and religious practice that we understand. The fact that actually what's driving it, and I think we do show it a number of ways in the book, is just that Hindus and Muslims, even if they live side by side, and that's increasingly rare, they just don't interact with each other. They don't mention themselves friends. There's a lot of network. You can see I sort of snuck in a subtitle in my presentation about network. So there was a lot of, I started off in network phase, right? So we actually collected a lot of data on people's personal networks that didn't make the volume, right? So there was intermediaries, there's a shopkeeper that you go to. There, of course, interacting with your neighbor. We have a lot of questions on marriage and who's, how that's being arranged. I think in all versions of that data, including shopkeepers and things, you are seeing frightening levels of segregation between Hindus and Muslims. Right? And just to very quickly jump to what Ashu said, I think when we talk about the spatial distribution of Hindus and Muslims in my chapter, it's very much driven by exactly the point that you made, right? That Hindu-Muslim violence has been seen as a very urban phenomenon that also structures space in the city, especially in places like Delhi. It's noticeable. My sort of very standard comment to people who know Delhi is, can you tell me the name of a Muslim neighborhood? Everyone gives you a name. Can you give me the name of 5 Muslim neighborhoods? Give me 5. Can you give me the name of a scheduled caste neighborhood? Very hard to do. There are areas of slums that we know, what we call Dalit bastis, right? But you wouldn't associate an entire neighborhood with scheduled caste. That doesn't happen really in our popular imagination. So thinking a little bit about why that popular imagination, even as a lived experience, right? This is a Hindu area, this is a Muslim area, as opposed to this is a Dalit area, this is an OBC area, this is an Uppercast area. Mind you that in the village, you would say, this is a Dalit area, this is an OBC area, this is an Uppercast area. So thinking a little bit about what's happened there with space. Emmerich question on, and Ashu, I'll get back to your final comments. Emmerich's question on 4 different states, different legal structures. How do you think about grouping these legal regimes? So actually, Patrick saw some of this is taking place. It was quite chaotic for us to think about how much to drill down and think about these as separate entities or one whole entity. If you read the book in whole, you'll see that it was never resolved. So some of us do break down in various ways, different states, different parts of NCR. Other people only look at Delhi. Other people just simply take NCR as a single unit and analyze. And that was, we left it up to the authors, and we had a large discussion about how to do it. But I agree with you. I mean, I think especially, the one thing that didn't make this volume, that seems very odd because I'm a political scientist, is different kinds of party and political competition. But the main reason why I didn't make it is just, Haryana is so different than UP, is so different than Rajasthan, is so different than Delhi, that we just didn't feel like we could get away with it. But yeah, I mean, it continues to be something for us to sort of think through. Prerna's comment, I've touched on it briefly, but I'll sort of add one or two comments here about the separation of spheres of Hindus and Muslims. I mean, I think that the one takeaway that I have come to believe after giving a couple of these presentations and talking to other people is that some of the various methods that we developed in characterizing space, vis-a-vis identity and interaction and networks, my hope is that people build on it, make them better. Because I think this back and forth between physical space and social interaction, and really sort of teasing out what the relationship there is, there's a lot of work to do, right? And especially in understanding how Hindu-Muslim relations are changing in India, and especially in Indian cities. Patrick's question about the role of the state and mechanisms through which space is rational is, as Patrick mentioned, very explicitly in Patrick's chapter with Partha Mukhopadhyay, Shahana Sheikh, and Subhadra Banda, and also in Shomender's chapter, which I mentioned. The state is a very big actor because of the role of settlements. In a number of other places, in crime, in my chapter on spatial inequality. So one of the things that one wants to ask, and this ties very directly to something that Patrick mentioned, is that David Harvey hasn't spent a lot of time talking about India, but what he has talked about, I didn't agree with very much. And one of the things that that I sort of point out is that there's some comments made about the disciplining of property prices and the way that property works. And one of the pullbacks to that, of course, I also believe in the role of real estate markets. That's not what I'm arguing against. But the fact that you have slums and informal settlements on some of the most valuable pieces of land, there is a much more popular buy-in than people realize. Yes, it's publicly popular to say, oh, we'd like these places to be clean. But I think the average person also understands that the entire labor force would go away if a lot of these central slums were moved to the outskirts of the city, right? And there have been many attempts to sort of do these kinds of spatial rearrangements. And everybody has been in on making sure it doesn't happen. So just very quickly, the final comments from Ashu. No, we didn't have a rural sample. It's a huge drawback. It's a huge drawback. We noted when Devesh and Sumitra were also writing the chapter, saying that we would really like to be able to make this comparison. That's the reason why I sort of started with the sort of intellectual arc we had in sort of framing what urban space looks like. If I had more time, I would actually show you what we got in the new projects. We got some very interesting shapes of what urban clusters now look like once you're able to get the entire urban-rural gradient. So I, by the way, fully agree that Hindu-Muslim violence much more takes place in the city due to many of the phenomena that we've talked about and many of the phenomena that you've talked about in your own work. But a direct comparison is wanting. Given the data that we've collected here.
Rajesh seems to have a question. Emmerich?
Yeah. Rajesh?
Neelanjan, what a fantastic talk, and I only have admiration and sympathy in I don't know which one comes first to kind of try and pull this like massive amount of data and still call it a book, even if it's called Colossus. So it's a huge accomplishment. I just have a small taste of it. Even doing something small, it's a nightmare. But looks like you guys have pulled it through. I have one question, which is following Patrick's comment about state-created categories, and I've not read the book, on apologies, and I will read it, and it's it's on the perennial to-do list. Which is that, have you, in your book, have you kind of looked at the frames, this informal settlements as a kind of a category to use a bunch of all the rest of the analysis you've done to kind of compare how would state-created categories would fall out in terms of all the stuff that you've uncovered? Because it looks like, from what I understood, is you created different, you didn't really, except there are a couple of chapters where that frame was taken as a given. The rest of the chapters, if I understand correctly, you kind of went organically based on your own sampling strategies and survey data, and then try and pull together like what it tells about, the Gandhi Ambedkar question and all the other, points that you made. The question is, is there an attempt to systematically compare how does the state-created categories, what does that tell us compared to this kind of your own sampling, strategies that you've done, and to kind of, maybe that would make it a double Colossus. But I was just wondering whether, with that, like, if you didn't do it, why didn't you do it? I guess it's an unkind question, but I'm just surprised. It looks like a full toss on the Lex, on the Lex side to kind of whack it. So I'm just wondering whether, if the states created this 8 different types and they created these categories and it has effects, why didn't you kind of take that on as a frame to at least compare?
So, I do think the chapters, and we've only very briefly touched on the chapters that Patrick is a part of and that Shomendra has written. They of course start with the frame, but in some sense, the real innovation that happens in these chapters is the linking of our survey data, which is not using administrative data as a frame at all, with the administrative data that they've collected in this other project, right? Which is actually very different. So I didn't go through some of the stuff that Shomendra did, and he was sort of the heart and soul behind getting that connection together for both of those chapters. So in some sense, that very process did actually create a lot of these kinds of questions, right? And sort of trying to compare across what it is that we have. So like, for instance, you see that there's this funny category that I didn't discuss much, which is mixed colony. Now, mixed colony doesn't exist as a Delhi phenomenon. What happened in mixed colony is that our sampling unit, which is a polling booth area, actually included pieces of 3 different types, right? So this is kind of, this is the kind of stuff that is happening, right? There's some discussion of that in the chapters. I think that we could have done, we made a strategic decision, which, may or may not have been the right idea, which is we did also sacrifice some level of depth for breadth, right? So in other words, I can see that the amount of data that Shomendra and Patrick, all these guys uncovered, like we gave them 2 chapters and we could have given them 5, right? So like, this is just sort of the way that the beast, but then we maybe wouldn't have been able to comment on energy or crime, right? So that was sort of the way that the volume took shape. But what I would say is that if you are interested in these questions, we actually probably do have a lot more than what made it in print. And you actually have access to many of these books. So.
All right, I want to be particularly conscious of the time in Delhi right now, as I think it's approaching midnight. And Neelan, thank you so much for presenting this book and engaging in conversation with all of us. I also wanted to mention that the next joint seminar in South Asian politics will be Sanjoy Bhattacharya from the University of York presenting smallpox eradication, a racially inclusive history. But before we all sign off, I wanted all of you to join me in thanking Neelan for what was a wonderful talk and very, very impressive work. And I look forward to reading the book in full very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.